Sarah Miller's hands were shaking the morning she found the boy behind the dumpster, and not from the cold. She would later realize that some moments split your life into before and after, and this was hers. The child was soaking wet, pressed against the brick wall like he was trying to disappear into it, and when their eyes met, she saw something that made her forget every rule she'd ever learned about calling the police first and asking questions later. She saw pure terror. The fog was thick that morning in Ashfield, the kind that turned the fishing boats in the harbor into ghosts. Sarah had been working at Betty's Cafe for 3 years, long enough that the smell of coffee and bacon grease had become part of her skin. Long enough that she knew every regular by name and order. Long enough that people stopped asking her about moving on after Daniel died. They just let her exist in her small apartment above the bookstore, in her early morning shifts, in her safe and predictable routine. Until today. The boy couldn't have been more than 9 years old. His clothes were expensive, she noticed that right away. Designer jeans torn at the knee. A wool coat that cost more than her monthly rent, now covered in mud and seawater. His shoes were leather, the kind parents buy for special occasions, and they were scuffed beyond repair. But it was his hand that made her stomach turn. His right hand was bruised dark purple, the knuckles swollen. "Please don't tell anyone," he whispered when she knelt beside him. His voice was hoarse, like he'd been screaming. "They'll take me back." Sarah's brain screamed at her to call someone. Child services. The police. Anyone. But her heart, that traitorous thing that had barely beaten properly since Daniel's funeral, suddenly came alive with something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Purpose. She looked over her shoulder at the cafe's back door, then back at the boy. "Can you walk?" He nodded quickly, desperately. She took his good hand and led him through the kitchen entrance, praying Betty hadn't come in early. The storage room was dusty and full of cardboard boxes, but it had a lock on the inside. "Stay here," she told him. "Don't make a sound. I'll bring you food." She made it back to the counter just as the first customers walked in. Old Pete from the harbor smelling like fish and diesel. Martha who taught at the elementary school. The mailman whose name she could never remember. She poured coffee with steady hands and smiled at their small talk, but her mind was in that storage room with a terrified child who wore $1,000 clothes and wouldn't tell her his name. During the breakfast rush, she made an extra plate of pancakes. Scrambled eggs. Hot cocoa piled high with whipped cream. She waited until Betty went to the bathroom, then slipped into the storage room. The boy was exactly where she'd left him, sitting on an overturned crate with his knees pulled to his chest. When he saw the food, his eyes went wide. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, setting the plate down on a box. He hesitated so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly, "Eli." "Eli," she repeated. "I'm Sarah. You're safe here, okay? But I need to know what you're running from." He picked up the fork with his bruised hand and winced. "I can't tell you. You'll make me go back." "Back where?" "Home." The way he said it made home sound like a prison. Sarah watched him eat. He had manners, she noticed. Said thank you. Used his napkin. Sat up straight even though he was clearly exhausted. This wasn't some street kid. This was someone raised with rules and expectations, and probably a dining room table that sat 12. Which made everything so much worse, because what kind of home makes a child this afraid? She let him sleep in the storage room that day. Between lunch orders and afternoon coffee runs, she checked on him. He was curled up under an old tablecloth she'd given him, dead to the world. Betty commented that Sarah seemed distracted, and her friend Maggie joked that she probably met a guy. If only it were that simple. That night, after the cafe closed, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't leave him in that storage room. The temperature was dropping and he needed a real bed. She woke him gently and led him out the back door, looking both ways like a criminal. Her apartment was only 2 blocks away, but those 2 blocks felt like miles. Every car that passed made her heart jump. Every stranger on the sidewalk looked like a threat. Her apartment was small. 1 bedroom, a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, and a living room dominated by Daniel's old bookshelf that she couldn't bring herself to get rid of. "You take the bed," she told Eli. "I'll sleep on the couch." "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "I know." She made him shower while she found clothes that might fit. An old t-shirt of Daniel's. Sweatpants she'd bought too big and never returned. When Eli came out, his dark hair wet and messy, she saw him clearly for the first time. He was beautiful in that way rich kids often are, well-fed and well cared for, with features that spoke of good genetics and better healthcare. Except for his eyes. His eyes were old. Before bed she saw it. The bracelet. Thin gold chain on his left wrist with initials engraved so small she almost missed them. Heir. She didn't ask about it. Something told her she didn't want to know the answer yet. That night, lying on her couch staring at the ceiling, Sarah whispered to herself, just for one night. But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Across the state in Boston, in an office that overlooked the harbor from 30 floors up, Edward Russo was not sleeping. He stood at the window with a glass of scotch, watching the city lights blur in the rain, and tried to remember the last time he'd put his son to bed. A month ago. Time moved differently in his world, measured not in days but in deals and debts and bodies that occasionally turned up in the harbor. His phone buzzed. Vincent Caro's name appeared on the screen. Edward didn't want to answer because answering meant hearing that they still hadn't found Eli, and every hour his son was missing was another hour Edward aged a year. But he answered anyway. Nothing yet, Vincent said. But we're expanding the search. Every bus station, train depot, shelter between here and the coast. He's 9 years old, Vincent. He's not some criminal mastermind. How is this taking so long? There was a pause. Kids can be resourceful when they're scared. Edward's grip tightened on his glass. Scared of what? Of me. Vincent didn't answer, which was answer enough. Edward hung up and threw the phone onto his leather chair. His reflection in the window looked like a stranger. When had he become someone his own son would run from? When had the business, the family, the empire he'd built to provide for Eli become the thing that drove him away? He thought about his wife, Maria, dead now 5 years from cancer. She would have known what to do. She would have noticed Eli pulling away. She would have asked the right questions. But Maria was gone, and Edward had buried his grief in work, in power, in making sure no one ever threatened his family again. Except now the threat was him. In Ashfield, Sarah woke to the smell of coffee. For a confused moment she thought Daniel was in the kitchen, that the last 2 years had been a dream. Then she remembered. She sat up to find Eli standing by her tiny stove, carefully pouring coffee into 2 mugs. I hope you don't mind, he said. You looked tired. She should have been angry. He was 9 and shouldn't be using the stove. But instead she felt something crack open in her chest. Thank you, she managed. Over the next few days they fell into a rhythm. Sarah would go to work, telling Betty she had a stomach bug and needed shorter shifts. Eli would stay in the apartment, drawing in a small sketch pad he'd had in his coat pocket. He drew the harbor. Sarah's profile as she read on the couch. He was talented, really talented, and she wondered what other gifts he had that the world might never see. Slowly he began to talk. About his father who was always busy. About the big house in Boston that felt empty even with 20 rooms. About his mother who died when he was 4 and left a hole nothing could fill. He didn't talk about why he ran, not yet, but Sarah didn't push. She figured the truth would come when he was ready. But Ashfield was changing around them. Sarah noticed it on day 3. Black SUVs with tinted windows driving slowly down Main Street. Strangers in expensive coats asking questions at the gas station. Maggie mentioned that some detective types had been poking around, showing photos of a missing kid. Sarah's blood ran cold. On day 4 he came to the cafe. Vincent Caro looked like money and danger wrapped in a tailored suit. He ordered coffee, black, and sat at the counter with a photograph. Miss Miller, is it? His smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm with a private investigation firm. We're looking for a missing boy. He slid the photo across the counter. His family is desperate to find him. Sarah looked at Eli's school picture. He was smiling in it, really smiling, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. She wondered when that photo was taken and what happened between then and now to kill that light. Haven't seen him, she said, meeting Vincent's gaze. But I hope you find him. Vincent studied her for a long moment. Too long. Like he could see through her skin to the lie underneath. Thank you for your time, he finally said. If you do see him, here's my card. There's a reward. She took the card with fingers that didn't shake, which felt like a miracle. The second he left, she pulled out her phone and texted Eli a code word they'd agreed on. Lighthouse. Meant danger. Pack your things. Be ready to run. That night, Eli finally told her everything. They sat on her couch with the curtains drawn, and he spoke in a voice so quiet she had to lean close to hear. He'd been in his father's office looking for a book. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he'd been in that room 100 times before and his father never minded. Except this time Vincent was there. And Uncle Tony. Except Tony wasn't really his uncle, just one of his father's old friends who always brought Eli candy and asked about school. They were arguing. Eli hid behind the door, knowing he shouldn't listen but unable to move. Tony was saying something about going to the FBI, about being tired of living with blood on his hands, about wanting out. And Vincent had pulled out a gun. Just like that. No warning. No hesitation. 2 shots to the chest and Tony was dead on the expensive carpet Eli's mother had picked out a decade ago. I ran, Eli whispered. I didn't think, I just ran. I took money from the safe in my room and ran, and I didn't stop until I got to the bus station. I didn't know where to go. I just picked the farthest place I could afford. Sarah's hands were shaking again. She was harboring a witness to murder. She was hiding evidence. She was in so far over her head she couldn't even see the surface anymore. We have to call the police, she said. No. Eli grabbed her arm. You don't understand. My father. The police can't help. Half of them are on his payroll. If they find me they'll take me back and Vincent will make sure I don't talk. Your father wouldn't let that happen. My father doesn't know. He thinks Vincent is loyal. He trusts him more than anyone. Tears streamed down Eli's face. Please, Sarah. Please don't call them. She held him while he cried and tried to figure out what to do. But fate didn't give her time to decide. They came the next evening. Sarah was closing the cafe, counting the register in the back office, when she heard cars pulling into the alley. Too many cars. She looked out the window and saw them. Black SUVs forming a semicircle. Men in suits getting out. And then she saw Eli through the cafe window, frozen on the sidewalk where he'd been waiting for her. She ran outside just as Vincent stepped forward. Miss Miller, he said. You've been very kind to the boy. But this ends now. He's coming with us. Sarah positioned herself between Vincent and Eli. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break her ribs. No, she said. He's not. Vincent's expression hardened. Don't make this difficult. What are you going to do? Shoot me in the middle of Main Street. The sound of another engine made them all turn. A black Mercedes pulled into the alley, newer and sleeker than the SUVs, and when the back door opened, Edward Russo stepped out. Sarah knew who he was instantly. It wasn't just the expensive suit or the way his men straightened when he appeared. It was the way he moved, the weight of absolute authority in every step. Eli's reaction confirmed it. Dad, he breathed, and then he was running, not away but toward Edward, and Sarah's entire understanding of the situation shifted. Eli crashed into his father's chest, and Edward's arms came around him automatically, protectively. For just a moment he looked like any other father reunited with his lost child. Then Eli spoke. He killed Uncle Tony. Vincent killed him. I saw it, Dad. I saw everything. The temperature in the alley dropped 20 degrees. Edward's eyes lifted from his son to Vincent, and Sarah saw something in that gaze that made her understand why people feared this man. It wasn't anger. It was colder than anger. It was the absolute certainty of judgment. Vincent, Edward said quietly. Is this true? Vincent's hand moved toward his jacket. He didn't even get it halfway before 2 of Edward's men had guns pointed at his head. Eddie, listen, Vincent started. Tony was going to rat. He was going to burn everything we built. I did it for the family. For you. You did it for yourself, Edward said. And you were going to kill my son to cover it up. No, I would never. Don't insult me by lying. Edward looked at his men and nodded once. Just once. The gunshots echoed off the brick walls. Vincent fell and didn't move. Sarah's ears were ringing. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She just witnessed a murder. 2 of them now if you counted Tony's story. This wasn't a story anymore. This was real. This was a body on the ground and blood pooling in the cracks of the concrete and a 9-year-old boy who'd seen too much. Edward turned to her. His expression softened slightly but his eyes remained hard. You protected my son, he said. You kept him safe when you had no reason to. When anyone else would have turned him in for the reward. Why? Sarah's voice came out stronger than she felt. Because he was a scared kid who needed help. That's it. That's the only reason. Edward studied her for a long moment. Then he said to his men, "No one touches her. Ever. Make sure everyone knows. She's under protection." He looked back at Sarah. "You'll need to come with us. Just for tonight. We need to make sure you're safe." It wasn't a request. Sarah found herself in the back of the Mercedes with Eli still clinging to her hand, driving away from her simple life toward something she couldn't begin to comprehend. Edward's mansion sat outside Boston on 5 acres of carefully manicured property. Inside it was all marble and crystal and the kind of quiet that money buys. Staff moved like ghosts. Guards stood at every entrance. Eli led Sarah to a sitting room with ceilings so high her entire apartment could fit inside. Edward poured himself a drink and offered her one. She shook her head. "I need to understand something," he said. "You could have sold information about my son to my enemies. You could have called the FBI. You could have demanded money. Instead you gave him your bed and made him pancakes. Why?" "I already told you." "Tell me again." Sarah looked at Eli, who was finally starting to relax, curled up in a chair that swallowed him. "Because kindness shouldn't need a reason," she said. "Because 2 years ago I lost someone I loved and I stopped believing good things could happen. Then I found Eli and maybe helping him was helping me too." Something shifted in Edward's face. "My wife used to say kindness is what makes us human. I forgot that. I forgot a lot of things." He looked at his son, including how to be a father. That night, Sarah watched Edward and Eli talk. Really talk for what looked like the first time in years. She saw Edward listen as Eli explained how lonely he'd been, how invisible. She saw Eli cry when Edward apologized for choosing business over him. She saw something broken start to heal, and it made her ache for what she'd lost with Daniel and would never get back. In the morning, Edward found her in the guest room where she'd barely slept. "You can't be part of this world," he said. "It's not safe and you don't deserve to live with that danger. But I'm going to make sure my world never touches you again." He'd already arranged everything. Her rent paid for a year. A quiet word to Betty explaining Sarah had to leave town suddenly for family reasons. Her name scrubbed from every report, every record, every whisper about Vincent's death. As far as the world was concerned, she'd never been there. "I don't want your money," Sarah said. "I know. That's why you're getting it anyway." Eli cried when they said goodbye. He pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. "I drew this for you," he said. "So you don't forget." She unfolded it later in the car back to Ashfield. It was her sitting on her couch with a book and she was smiling. She didn't remember smiling while he drew, but maybe he'd seen something in her she couldn't see herself. Maybe he'd drawn not who she was, but who she could be again. Life returned to normal slowly. Betty welcomed her back with questions Sarah couldn't answer. Maggie hugged her and demanded to know where she'd been. Sarah made up a story about a sick aunt in Vermont and tried to forget the sound of gunshots echoing in an alley. But she couldn't forget Eli. Some nights she'd wake up worried, wondering if he was okay, if Edward had kept his promises, if that brief moment of connection between father and son had lasted. She'd never know. That was the price of walking away from that world. 3 months passed. Winter turned to spring. The fog lifted from the harbor and tourists started returning to Ashfield. Sarah was working the morning shift when Maggie brought in the mail. Bills mostly. A postcard from Betty's sister in Florida. And a thick envelope with no return address. Sarah opened it in the back room with shaking hands. Inside was a check. $500,000. And underneath, a note in elegant handwriting. "Because of you, I still believe good people exist. Er." She sat down hard on a milk crate and cried. Not sad tears but something else. Something like hope. Because maybe kindness did matter. Maybe one small act of courage could ripple outward and change things. Maybe the world wasn't as dark as she'd thought. Sarah deposited the check the next day. She quit her job at Betty's not because she didn't need it anymore, but because she realized Maggie had been right all along. She did need excitement. She needed purpose. She used the money to go back to school to study social work to learn how to help kids like Eli who fell through the cracks. Years later she'd sometimes see news stories about Edward Russo. Business deals. Charity donations. Rumors about his organization going legitimate. She never knew if that was true or just good PR. But she liked to think that maybe, just maybe, that week in Ashfield had changed him too. Because that's what kindness does. It doesn't just save one person. It ripples outward, touching lives in ways you never expect, changing futures you'll never see. Sarah learned that the morning she found a terrified boy behind a dumpster and chose to help instead of walking away. And somewhere in Boston, a man who'd forgotten how to be human remembered. And a boy who'd seen too much darkness learned that light still existed. And a waitress who'd buried herself in routine after loss found a reason to live again. The weight of kindness, Sarah discovered, isn't a burden. It's the only thing that makes life worth carrying.